yeah, we can talk through the material that I present afterwards. So I'll cover a little bit of background to why we have done this, briefly in terms of what NDCs, nationally determined contributions, are, and then why integrate social protection in NDCs, and then some of the content from the notes, so the messages that we've incorporated about what people should keep in mind when thinking about integrating social protection into NDCs, some key steps, and then some reflections at the end. So, as Shayanti already said, why now? Well, NDCs, nationally determined contributions, are being updated in 2025. We've said early 2025 here, but I think a lot of countries will push beyond March, and what we've heard from people in the climate space is more around September as a kind of deadline that a lot of people will be working to. So that gives us also a little bit more room for this kind of engagement. And the idea is that they should hopefully have them in place before COP. And the briefing note aims to provide an introduction to NDCs for social protection ministries and agencies. So it's specifically focused at this audience, and also practical guidance on how to engage in the process. So just before I kind of get started on the note, and I'll sort of elaborate a little bit more on those points in a minute, just to say that this built on both, I guess, the approach and the content for last year's work around a joint statement on directing international climate finance towards social protection, which was a product from the group. Perhaps we can put it into the chat for anybody who might not be aware of that already. And yeah, I just really want to acknowledge that it was this excellent, fantastic collaborative effort. So we had a drafting team of people who came together over the summer. So we're working on this in August, July, August. And then a wider group of people who gave us really useful, really valuable feedback on the draft. So a lot of those were people within the working group in terms of drafting, and then the wider review group were people external as well. So we had some climate colleagues feeding in. But yeah, I think it was just an excellent collaborative effort, and I guess a model for us to replicate going forward if we see similar niches, I think. And thanks to everyone for their hard work if they were involved in the document. And also just to say that there's now a version, so I've said it's focused specifically on social protection ministries, and we acknowledge the kind of need to have a similar document that we could use to engage with those who are not experts in social protection, so usually ministries of environment and climate, perhaps ministries of finance. So we're working now also jointly with the Adaptive Social Protection and Climate Finance Task Force that BMZ are supporting. We're working on a new iteration of that, and we've got the NDC partnership, this capacity building body that supports countries in their NDCs, involved also in the process of developing that. So watch this space. Yeah, so just briefly, what are NDCs? So it's every country who is party to the Paris Agreement on climate change commits to producing an NDC. So they're a compulsory document. You may have heard of national adaptation plans, for example, which are not compulsory, so countries choose. But if you're party to the Paris Agreement, you have to produce this document. And it sets out both actions to reduce the rate of climate change, so climate change mitigation, and actions to address its impacts, so climate change adaptation. A little context is that the early iterations of NDCs were very focused on mitigation, but there is now a move to broaden the focus of NDCs, make them a broad-based climate strategy that talks to mitigation, yes, but also to adaptation. So it looks a bit different in different countries. So that the pace at which this is changing is a bit different in different countries, but certainly there's a shift more broadly towards this sort of broader-based approach to the NDC. They're reviewed and updated every 5 years. And usually this process is led by a Ministry of Climate Change or Environment. However, they're supposed to, they almost always say that they are taking a whole of government approach. Again, probably in early iterations, it was more ministries of energy, infrastructure, transport who were involved with more of a focus on climate mitigation. And now there's, a shift, and I think a genuine appetite to expand the range of sectors and ministries that they're working with. So this is a real opportunity for us to engage in that process. So why are NDCs relevant for social protection? So if we think about in terms of what NDCs do, if we're interested in connecting social protection and the climate agenda, NDCs provide this foundation for countries' overall priorities and this coordinated multi-sectoral approach. They also inform the allocation of climate finance. So it's a really important document when you are then trying to attract and channel climate finance into social protection as an instrument for inclusive climate action. It's really important, really helpful to have that reflected in the NDC document. And it also builds on the global agendas that have shifted really over the last few years to recognise the role of social protection in relation to inclusive climate action. So this would be, acknowledgement of social protection, the global goal on adaptation, on operationalizing. Can never do this word. Operationalizing loss and damage. Got it. The Just Transition Work Programme, and also, this recognition in the IPCC last review document, which talks extensively about the connections between social protection and climate action. And yeah, I should probably have done this slide before, actually, because this is the kind of underlying rationale, yeah? So we're interested in social protection because it helps to break this two-way relationship between climate vulnerability and climate change. So, poorer people are more vulnerable to climate change, and climate change exacerbates exacerbates existing vulnerabilities. Social protection can play a really critical role in relation to this. And it can contribute across every dimension of climate action. So that is climate adaptation. We've got evidence about social protection contributing to climate mitigation, and in terms of addressing loss and damage and a just transition. Now, I do a different presentation of this when we're actually presenting the notes to Ministry of Social Protection. I'm not going to kind of go into the detail here in this session. We can discuss a little bit maybe at the end. But yeah, broadly, we've got a very strong case to make as to why this is an area of interest, building on, lots of evidence, a growing kind of global agenda, the fact that the recent World Social Protection report by ILO, specifically focused on this space is fantastic and helps us to make the case, I think, with countries as well as at this kind of global level. So yeah, we've got this very strong case, and hopefully the note sets this out rather well. Now, again, it's intended for working with ministries of social development, ministries of social protection, people involved in this space. But what I'm going to do now is kind of take you through the arguments that we use to speak to those agencies, speak to those ministries. And I think before I do that, to say, one of the concerns we had in writing the piece was to make sure that we don't give the sense that unless people are able to do everything that we're talking about, there's no point in engaging. So there's a lot of evidence that, the last round of NDCs, which we reviewed, really had a sort of pretty minimal connection to social protection in the majority of cases. An FAO review, we found 13% mentioned social protection, maybe a little higher in Africa and in low-income countries, but still pretty minimal. A few good examples, but essentially the baseline is very low. So just to say, I think, and again, we can discuss this later, but I think it's an important message that what we're asking is people to engage in this process. And if they can do it with a lot of energy and resources, and, that's fantastic. But if they can engage and make this the first step, that's also really worthwhile and valuable, because this is an ongoing process. But yeah, that said, the things we're emphasizing is, looking for a strategic role for social protection and thinking about it across all areas of climate action. So not just mitigation or not just adaptation, but every dimension of climate action, and thinking about how social protection can really contribute to the overall goals of the NDC. So, we're interested in from a sectoral perspective, but we're also interested in the contribution social protection makes in relation to climate action. Thinking about concrete measures as much as possible, actions, approaches. So that would be adapting existing social protection programs, thinking about the need for new social protection programs, and in whatever approach is taken, making sure that it's focused on strengthening social protection systems for the long term. climate change is going to be with us for the rest of our careers. We should be looking at how we build social protection systems that respond to these long-term challenges rather than a program or projectized approach. Um, Emphasizing the importance of social protection for this agenda about covering the poor, the vulnerable, and at-risk populations. If you look at the climate discourse right now, there's a lot of recognition across the board about the fact that climate action and climate finance is not meeting the needs of the poorest and the most vulnerable, and that we need to do more to make sure we get inclusive climate action that addresses the issues that people are facing on the front line of climate change in low and middle income countries. And social protection is a mechanism for doing that. And then, a couple more points would be around ensuring that in doing this, social protection is not a silver bullet, and this needs to be done in a coherent, multi-sectoral way, connecting as much as possible with different line ministries. And that might not be that isn't just the Ministry of of Environment and Climate, but also ministries of agriculture, ministries of labour, ministries of health, potentially. Then finally, using this process to identify finance gaps, ideally as specific as possible. But if we can't get specific numbers into the NDC, at least identifying processes that we could put in place to specify those financial gaps and look at the investment needs. So these are overarching, I guess, principles that we've specified in the note. And we've tried to give a few examples in there to make this kind of come to life a bit within the note itself. One example that we've been using quite extensively is in relation to Mozambique, where it's one of the better examples for an NDC. It's got 4 quite specific measures related to social protection built into there, and they've just recently had a major Green Climate Fund project approved, 28 million, which specifically links climate adaptation and social protection. It's building on the public works program of the government of Mozambique, and it's clearly aligned within the project documents with the NDC. So this is a really good example of exactly the kinds of approaches we should be thinking about. I think the executing entity is Save the Children in this case, but working very strongly with the government to put in place a program that really harnesses the existing social protection system to deliver climate action. Okay, so I'll just go through the 4 areas that we've identified in terms of steps, and then I'll make some sort of closing thoughts at the end. How am I doing on time?
Very good. You still have 10 minutes or so.
10 minutes. Okay, good. So yeah, we try to organize kind of points, and again, this thing about not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. I've just come back actually from a mission in Grenada and in Barbados, jointly with UNICEF, where we were working with ministries of social development and ministries of environment on this topic, on NDCs, using the note, working through this with them. I think there was real appetite. It was really helpful, which was very reassuring, but also, it looks a bit different. Barbados and Grenada are a slightly different stage in the conversation. What you can do in one context maybe is a bit of a challenge in this context. So it's, adapting this to the local context. But broadly speaking, we think these are helpful steps. So firstly, to suggest people, work out who the existing NDC focal point is. So there's a registry online where people can do that. Look at the current NDC. Often these aren't totally rewritten. These are revisions of the existing document. And so looking at the existing document gives you a very good handle for what is likely to be in the next document. They're kind of iterative. So going to the current document and identifying at least entry points for social protection if it's not already in there. Understanding where the process is at. This is already underway in most countries, although again, it'll look different in different contexts. The NDC partnership is very useful in that regard. So you can reach out to them for specific countries. I mean, not all, but many countries are members of this NDC partnership that provides basically support on a request basis for developing, good, robust NDCs, and are now engaging with us to see how we can incorporate social protection into that process. And then identifying the timeline and the next step, so making sure that you don't miss the boat, basically. Which, like I say, it kind of it will look different in different countries, but it really is happening kind of nowish. So the first quarter of next year is when a lot of these meetings, I think, will at least kick off. Secondly, something about connecting with key partners. So, if you're a Ministry of Social Development, Social Protection, reaching out to the lead ministry. So, as I said, Ministry of Environment or Climate Change. There's lists of focal points that you can get, but also trying to emphasize the importance of not only keeping this, yes, a whole of government approach, but there's also lots of stakeholders within countries who often have a lot to bring into these discussions in terms of data on vulnerability, but also on models and approaches. So, looking to identify social partners, CSOs, research institutions, or other actors who can really support you on this process. And that would also include many of us who are on this call. So, lots of agencies right now are supporting countries in this process. I think, again, at the end of the call, we can talk a little bit about, at the end of the presentation, a little bit about how we coordinate better on this, partly through the NDC partnership, partly through this working group, to make sure that, we are able to all utilize, our resources and our strengths to collaborate and support different countries and try to get as many countries as possible doing it in this round of the NDCs. Okay, the third of our areas is entry points. So, once you've looked at the existing NDC, perhaps got a sense from the NDC coordinator for a country of if there's going to be big changes, or if it's basically, you're feeding into the same sectoral strategies, looking for entry points and gaps and shortcomings. And, they're not long documents, often 15, 20, maybe 30 pages, not longer than that. So it's possible to do this quite rapidly. And then to think, okay, in terms of those gaps, it might be a focus on specific vulnerable groups. So this there's a link to a really excellent tool that UNICEF developed, the Every Child Data platform for NDCs, where you can kind of think through in relation to children, but we can do this for different sectoral and population groups. And so, yeah, like I say, looking through, thinking about the priority sectors, energy, agriculture, health, usually in there. Social development might be in there. There's a whole range of different sectors that people take, and seeing how social protection can contribute, I guess, across all of those areas. And yeah, I mean, again, we've tried to link as much as possible to existing tools, and I guess we're going to feed in over the coming years as well to make the social protection even more visible within these tools. But the NDC 3.0 Navigator is, I think, really helpful and has a specific I'm not sure what they call it, a specific bit anyway, on just and equitable transitions. And I mean, a few of us fed in a little bit. I think Jana fed in quite extensively into the development of the navigator. So yeah, flagging up these kind of tools people can look at for supporting the process. And then yeah, finally, shaping the NDC. So our suggest, where resources, where time allows, bringing together. So not just relying on the, one collaborative or consultation event where all the ministries will be in the room, but trying to actually bring partners together to have a specific sectoral discussion. So this is the kind of thing we were doing in Grenada and in Barbados, and I think it was really, really valuable. So they'll be feeding into the overall consultation process, but also to have these separate meetings. And that will allow you then to think about the priorities for social protection within the NDC and how this connects to budgeting processes, fiscal allocations, having some of those conversations as early as possible. And also, how do we incorporate targets and indicators into the NDC that demonstrates success, but also drives forward implementation, because the implementation of the NDC will be as important as what we get into it in the first place. Okay. So those were the kind of four areas. I mean, some of those key principles, and then four areas that we've identified. Again, I'm assuming that we shared the actual document in the chat. When you go there, we've got the kind of detail sitting under this. I've got just two more slides. So one is speaking to this issue about, okay, so what do we want to think about in terms of engaging at the country level? This kind of outreach to government counterparts. As much as possible. So that would be in social protection, but then also other relevant ministries. So for FAO, the connection between the social protection programs and what the Ministry of Agriculture are doing in the climate space is really critical. And the NDC is an opportunity to start having those conversations if those connections are not already built in. So, I think the NDC partnership is potentially really a valuable partner in doing this in specific countries, and also more sort of at the global level. We're trying to engage with them as much as possible, and it will help us to kind of get those engagements in Ministry of Environment and also Finance. yeah, again, maybe we can talk through a little bit about how we've already had discussions about how to make sure we can respond to as many requests that's coming in and how we can, aggregate and coordinate our support to different countries. And that would also include, other kind of approaches that are out there. So in the Task Force on Adaptive Social Protection and Climate Financing, supported by BMZ, is also working in this area. So we're collaborating with them to discuss how we jointly push this agenda forward. Um, yeah, and I mean I'm not going to speak to this too much. You've probably heard enough of me now. But it's maybe just a sort of final call to action, or that essentially, the NDCs, it's part of a process. Yeah. So, they're reviewed every 5 years. So if we miss the opportunity in a country this year, we can do it again in 2030. But I think getting in right now is a really helpful platform, not only for the NDC development, but also for then NDC implementation, other climate strategies, so the national adaptation plans, sectoral climate strategies. It helps us to build those connections between social protection and environment. I think it's also really useful. So in the Grenada example, where they're going to be developing a national social protection strategy or policy, that you also feed this back into the national social protection policy. So getting these conversations going makes it much easier then to work with social protection strategy as well as climate strategy on these issues. So it really gets a kind of builds those connections, gets people's feet in the door. And I think we need to be doing this with this kind of really long-term strategic mindset about what we're hoping to support countries to build, to address the climate crisis in the long term. Great. Well, I hope I kept roughly to time. Yeah, I'd be really interested in any thoughts, feedback, or yeah, I mean, both to me, but also we've got lots of colleagues on the call who were involved in developing the notes. So it's very much a product of all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Right on time. So well done. And yeah, no, I think there's already one comment in the chat around like mapping. But in general, I guess that's where we want to open up the floor and ask if there are any direct questions, but also how do you see from your introductions in the chat, many of us are working in close contact with national counterparts in countries, providing technical support in many different ways. So if we may open up the floor for questions, but also just reflections on how you see yourself engaging or advocating in this process of updating the NDC, that is very welcome. So yeah, any questions? If not, maybe just because this is there in the chat, mapping who is doing what where will be a challenge. Maybe Matthew, because you just had that experience in Grenada and Barbados, and how did you face this, and how did you tackle that? Because this is definitely something like who's doing which ministry, what, where are they at? So do you have any insights on this?
Maybe a couple of comments. I suppose because there's two different levels. I'd initially read that as about mapping what people are doing at a kind of global level to support this. I mean, and there we're just also speaking to this, with the NDC partnership, for example, where they're getting requests coming in. We're trying now to get a better system for dealing with and supporting those requests, where countries are asking for stuff that has a social protection connection. But also, yeah, I mean, coordinating amongst us all, I guess, at the global level about the countries that we're working in. So the group provides that kind of platform to do that. In country, yeah, so it is definitely a challenge. um, the but yeah, I mean, it was quite interesting to do the two countries at once. So Barbados, there was a bit more capacity. The Ministry of Environment, uh, people who came to our meeting had actually been at this event that we held in May, so they'd already got some background for this, and there was a kind of understanding that of the role social protection might have. But then when it came to this kind of cross-sectoral linkages, that was a big area for discussion. So trying to understand in that case, what the Ministry of Agriculture were doing, there are lots of relevant programs, They had a better connection with Ministry of Labour through social protection there, so an MOU with them and some really interesting potential programs. But the scope to do a lot more. And then through our discussions, other ministries came up. So Ministry of Education, for example, was one that people were quite concerned with, and there was another one with a housing mandate. Um, and it's a challenge to get those connections within this timely process. You have to be realistic, I think, about how many of those discussions you have. So we were kind of trying to help think through, okay, what's strategic, which ministries to bring in for this discussion now, and how to do this. But there was appetite, and there was quite good understanding of programs that kind of could relate at a general level, but then not enough to work this through into specifics for the NDC. So that needs to be further conversations. In Grenada, I guess it was, you know, um, starting from a slightly lower base in terms of the discussion. But again, people can intuitively see a lot of this. So, they've been hit, unfortunately, by Hurricane Beryl. We spent a bit of time, we wanted to focus not on just on shock response, but also on climate adaptation. But, thinking through Hurricane Beryl response was really useful for thinking about these cross-sectoral collaborations. So we actually spent a bit of time on this, trying to think about, okay, well, who were the ministries you needed to connect with? Where were the gaps? And therefore, who are the people you should be speaking to about thinking about programs going forward? So that lens was quite useful because it made it nice and concrete. And then again, they identified, I would say, a similar set of ministries where you would want this engagement. So yeah, I think in terms of who's doing what, if we're talking about ministerially, governmentally, and partners supporting, we will need to support ministries to think beyond just the social protection environment connection, I guess. Jana, I can see you've got your hand up.
Thanks. I just wanted to make a comment and maybe also ask you a question, Matthew, on this point on coordination, because I think there's another layer to this coordination on the national level, and that relates to the different agencies, right? So, I mean, we've been quite mindful also of the fact that, we don't have 10 agencies now approaching the ministry offering NDC support. And the one thing maybe to flag is that UNDP is the designated agency actually within the UN system that is meant to lead and coordinate the NDC support. So I think on the on the national level, it's always good also to sort of like then link up to them. And Matthew, I just wanted to know whether you've linked with them also in Grenada and Barbados, and sort of like how this sort of interagency coordination works. And maybe just one last comment. I mean, that's what we're also trying to do through the working group, right? So as much as possible, we try to keep each other informed. Which of us manages to leverage, different projects to also provide NDC support to see how we can get together. And I think, Matthew, your example with UNICEF is really good in the Caribbean of sort of getting together and as much as possible avoiding duplication of efforts and confusion, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's super relevant. So we can take maybe Nadia in a minute can tell us which of those mappings she was referring to, but hopefully we've answered all the different possibilities. So in terms of that coordination, yeah, I mean, I think it's super important. So in this particular context, we were working through our regional. Okay, she's confirmed all levels are important, so we're um, so yeah, we're working through our both regional and sub-regional and national colleagues, and sort of those existing partnerships. Now that's a partnership that we have at the sub-region with UNICEF there, so hence the coordination with them. And yeah, I agree. I think it's a really good way of working. There's a connection a lot with WFP programming in the region. Yeah, connecting with them. I think with ILO, this is a discussion, and the labour agenda, it's a discussion that we've got this colleague now kind of looped in that you connected in. Certainly in Barbados, I think there's real interest there, and it would be great to kind of keep that discussion going. We didn't connect with UNDP in that particular context. I mean, I think getting UNDP, I guess, into our wider coordination now that David's not there any longer would be kind of helpful, no? Particularly if they've got that role. But I mean, because we were kind of not piggybacking on, but we were connecting to what was already in place. There wasn't a big connection to UNDP programming there that we were kind of building on, I guess.
Mm.
And I
Yeah, yeah, I
think,
mean,
I
I
mean,
was
going,
just
yeah,
Yeah, no,
go
sorry. I
ahead.
was just asking to see how it then works in practice, right? Because that's just sort of always what I heard on the global level, that UNDP is meant to be sort of that coordinating entity. But then, of course, that's just for the NDC overall. And then you have all the different sectoral aspects where other agencies might be actually more better suited to support,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, I suspect it will look really quite different in different countries,
Yeah.
for all sorts of reasons. My
Hmm.
my my feeling is that, and it'll also look a bit different once you start reaching out to other sectoral ministries. So, where different partners might be engaged in climate programming, and if it comes up as a particularly, obvious or important connection, then, so I mean, the examples say would be health or education, where I can see, I know actually the health and education sectors are also themselves trying to work out how to better engage with this round of NDCs right now, but also in country, depending on what kind of programs are in place, it may be that those are some of the really important linkages. And I think, one of those factors will be also whether countries have, you know, social insurance at scale that is worth building into this process. When we looked at NDCs at the moment, there's nothing about social insurance in almost any of them. When you come across these linkages, it's almost always social assistance or active labour market interventions of one form or another, with social insurance really not connected. And that in itself brings in other partners. I mean, ILO, obviously, but it brings in, a range of other partners as well. So, um, yeah.
Thanks, Matthew. If I may also share one example, because you mentioned how we are engaging with the NDC partnership. And one of the requests, like as Matthew mentioned, there are technical requests, technical support requests that come to the partnership, and then there's decisions on how they are supported. One of the project countries we're working in is Mauritania, and one of the requests that they had sent to NDCP was around green jobs and unemployed youth, and engaging unemployed youth and how to integrate them in the NDC. And because we currently have an ongoing project in the country, in Mauritania, where we are working with the Social Protection Ministry to do this kind of work, it was easy for us to actually, we had a chance to look at what the request was. Then we went back to the ministry to say, well, there is a request from from the climate change department around this unemployed youth in this region. So is there some current program? And if there is no current program, is there something that we can think through to develop here? And we had no idea. We were doing a project in the country. We were looking into existing social protection programs. We were looking into alternative livelihood options that might be viable in these places where climate risks are quite quite strong. And so that was quite nice, because we were part of this NDC partnership. We got a chance to look into all these requests that countries have been sending, and then go back to the country, make this connection between the climate change department, who had requested certain support, and the Ministry of Social Protection, who had mandate over that, and make that connection, which they had not yet done in the country level. So I think there are all different ways of approaching this, and all different ways this may come together. But yeah, platforms like this would be one of also the ways to get started on where the countries are and what they're doing, and how to make those connections with the parties involved. Yeah.
I think that's a really good example. And just, I mean, you were making the point there that the NDC partnership request has to come from the focal person in the country, who usually sits in environment. Yeah, I mean, sometimes finance, I think, but usually environment. So, I mean, I guess in most cases it would have been, somehow from the ministry originally, but in many cases I mean, there may be disconnects, particularly if it's a kind of general request or slightly more generalized request that social protection could address, rather
Yeah.
than a specific request in relation to a specific bit of the social protection system. Yeah.
Yeah, and we realize often these are quite political. I mean, what requests get sent and what gets put into these documents. It's often also how in relationships within different ministries exist, and how they are. I mean, there's many things that matter, and fiscal allocations is one part of it. But we yes, where connections are
We go.
not
Have
built,
we lost
leveraging.
Shayanti?
Can you hear me?
I think she froze, yeah.
Oh no, she's come back.
Sorry, I was just saying that it's also depends on the political economy of the place, but I'll stop there, I think. And I think, are there any other questions at this point, or comments or reflections on what we just spoke? And do you see any relevance to your work?
Jana, do you just want to speak a little bit to the global accelerator point you put in the chat?
If Nadia indeed referred to I assume she meant the global accelerator with GA. Yes, okay, great. Good. As I was typing, I then wasn't that sure anymore. But yeah, I mean, we've actually just received a request from the Global Accelerator team as well to provide them with a briefing on the note and the general support to NDCs, also in the context of the wider issue around just transition in the NDCs. So yeah, I think it could, especially in those global accelerator pathfinder countries, be another good avenue for trying to provide support and trying to ensure that issues around jobs, decent work, social protection, and just transition, of course, are integrated in the NDCs. So in January, we'll have probably an internal session where we were asked to present on the note, and then we'll see how we can leverage that. I think first we'll do it internally with the ILO, but I assume that we will then also widen this to the rest of the technical support facility, which includes the other all the other agencies, including UNDP. So indeed, I think it's a good opportunity.
Great. So it doesn't look like there are any other burning questions. So, Jayanti, shall we?
Yeah, I think people can still type in if there are burning questions they realize as Diana starts speaking, but we can move into the next segment around COP and listen firsthand what Diana's experience was and what she has to share. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you. Let me quickly share. Can you see my screen? Oh, share. Yeah. Yes? Can you see it?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so I had the pleasure of being in Baku for almost 2 weeks at the COP. Following some of the negotiations, I specifically focused on the adaptation negotiations, but as part of the wider ILO delegation, I also followed what was going on in some of the other streams. So I just wanted to provide now a very brief overview of some of the key outcomes, and then it would be great to have a discussion with you all around the relevance of some of those outcomes for our community working on social protection. So just starting with a very quick recap. So we all remember what was relevant for us at COP28 and some of the outcomes that were agreed there. Matthew has already mentioned them actually and already referenced the key ones as part of his presentation earlier. But here's just a quick summary again. So COP28 established the Just Transition Work Program, and that decision text mentioned and made reference to social protection several times, including as a way to mitigate potential impacts associated with the transition, but also for the creation of decent work and quality jobs, including through social dialogue, social protection, and recognition of labor rights. Another very important and big win from COP28 was also the framework and the targets agreed for the global goal on adaptation. And one of the 7 thematic targets also referred to social protection, and that's the target on reducing the adverse effects of climate change and poverty eradication and livelihoods, including through the promotion of adaptive social protection measures for all. And then, as Matthew also said, around the operationalization, and I was very happy to hear that even a native speaker has problems with this word because I stumble over it every time as well. Adaptive social protection was also mentioned in some of the conclusions. So this was sort of like the three key negotiation streams, I think, that we were also keeping an eye on. And I'll give a quick update on each of those now from COP29. But first, the whole discussion at COP was obviously framed around the financing question. So you may have read several times in the news that this was really dubbed as the finance COP. And that is because one of the major agenda items were the negotiations around the new climate finance goal, also called the NCQG, which is the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. So many of you may have been familiar with this number of $100 billion a year, which parties had agreed to channel from developed to developing countries. And this goal was now up for renegotiation. Developing countries had asked for $1.3 trillion a year. Finally, the negotiation settled on $300 billion per year to be reached by 2035, with developed countries taking the lead. There were huge discussions around an expansion of the contributor base to also include countries such as China or UAE, which have now developed quite rapidly in the recent years, of course. But in the end, the text settled with a provision for voluntary contributions, but not required contributions from those kinds of countries. I mean, overall, as many of you have probably followed in the news, there was a lot of discontent with this sort of final figure, as it significantly falls short of the needs. On the other hand, there has been at least some progress and some agreement reached, so a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, I've just had some quick thoughts around, what this means for social protection. Of course, we're speaking a lot about channeling more international climate finance to social protection, but there is a little bit the question, actually, to what extent all of our social protection financing gap figures are actually even factored into the needs for climate finance that are estimated by developing countries. So that might be something that we'd want to look in as well and see how all of these things relate. And then, of course, the other important thing to note here with the NCQG outcome is that contrary to what has been requested and called for by developing countries and also lots of civil society organizations, this new NCQG does not include a sub-window for loss and damage. So it only relates to financing for mitigation and for adaptation, which makes it very sort of, it makes it very unclear how additional financing for loss and damage will be raised going forward. On the Just Transition Work Program, there has been no outcome agreed at all. So parties didn't manage to come to an agreement, and matters were deferred to SP 62, which is always the meeting that takes place halfway between the COPs in Bonn in June. The key issues of divergence in the Just Transition Work Program were around the fact that some countries really wanted an actionable work plan underpinned by means of implementation. And when they speak about means of implementation, usually they mean finance from developed countries to developing countries. There's a lot of discussions around unilateral trade restrictive measures and to what extent they relate to just transition. That was already the case last year as well. And that's things like the EU carbon border adjustment, for example, and the impact that such trade measures have actually on the exporting countries, and to what extent those things should be fall under discussions around just transition in the COP. with some countries referring to the fact that such things should not have a place at climate negotiations, but rather would be an issue to be taken up by the World Trade Organization, for example. And then there were also quite a few divergences around the extent to which the just transition text should be referring to or not the agreed language around transitioning away from fossil fuels that was reached at COP last year. So lots of things that were already discussed were kind of came back to the surface again, and in the end, countries couldn't really agree on much. One important reflection, I think that will be more and more relevant for us, is that even in the draft text that was discussed, there's a growing recognition and demand, especially from developing countries, that just transition pathways must also include considerations for adaptation and resilience. So it does not just relate to mitigation policies and what they mean for workers, but it's also important to think about ways in which adaptation and resilience can be designed so that it enhances decent work, social inclusion, and poverty eradication. And obviously, social protection plays a key role here. So I think more and more we should also be thinking about how we can frame our messages around that. And in fact, the text that they were discussing that wasn't adopted in the end, but that text had actually proposed for the next official dialogue on the Just Transition Work Program to be around the topic of adaptation and resilience in the context of just transition. So I think that's something to watch. On the adaptation, the two main ones were around the global goal on adaptation that did result in a text adopted, so that's good. And that text had provided important additional guidance to the experts that are currently working on the UAE Beleng work program on indicators. So last year at Dubai, they established a work program to now develop the indicators for each of these thematic targets, plus the dimensional targets that were agreed. And that's obviously really important for us because one of the targets does relate to social protection. So now it will be really important that we actually get a good indicator on social protection agreed then at Beleng at COP30. There were, again, a lot of diverging opinions around, again, this topic of means of implementation, with some countries really wanting there to be actually also indicators that tracks the means of implementation to adaptation. In the end, they reached a compromise, which is indicators for enablers of implementation, which doesn't just include finance, but also things like governance and transparency, which the developed countries are always very keen on. And then there was a big question around this issue of transformational adaptation. There's a UNFCCC report that was published just before COP, there, I think it will be really important and interesting for us to see to what extent and how conceptually social protection relates to transformational adaptation, because there was quite a lot of talk about it during the negotiations. On the NAPs, unfortunately, also here, parties didn't manage to agree on anything, and the draft text was forwarded to SP 62 again in Bonn. Again, lots of the disagreement is around, again, means of implementation for formulation and implementation of NAP, also around the inclusion or not of these transformational adaptation approaches. But I think what's promising and what hopefully will stay is that the draft text suggested that NAPs could or should cover the 7 thematic targets. So again, I think that's a really good entry point also for us in terms of integrating social protection in national adaptation plans. Because of course, social protection being included in one of those 7 targets. And I think that could be another one for us to put on our agenda maybe going forward. We had discussed it anyway, but potentially to, do a little bit of a similar sort of review of NAPs as we've done for the NDCs, and sort of think about some guidance around integrating social protection and NAPs potentially. And I mean, I have heard from several um, also government counterparts that were at the COP that, this kind of reference of social protection in these global policy documents really helps in arguing then on the national level that social protection should be included and social protection actors should have a seat at the table when, for example, designing documents such as the NAPs. So it just shows that these kinds of global policy decisions do eventually filter down to the country level and are actually helpful in creating these entry points. Um, on loss and damage, the fund for responding to loss and damage is now operational, and at COP some key documents were signed for the fund to start distributing money in 2025. There were also some additional pledges, which took the total of the money for the fund from 674 to 759 million US dollars. But however, as I said, parties or developing countries especially were not successful in arguing for a specific sub window for loss and damage under the NCQG, which sort of puts the replenishment of the fund a little bit into question. And at the moment, we're a little bit sort of stuck with this thing of, passing the hat around at every COP and hoping that some more countries will put some pledges towards it, which, is not as ideal. The other big agenda item there was the review of the WIM and the Santiago network. But again, as well here, there was no outcome reached and the matter was deferred to SP62 as well. There were some disagreements about the location of the Santiago network offices, even though that had already been agreed a few months ago for it to be in Geneva. But then there were calls that additional regional offices should be established. There was a proposal for the WIM ExCom to produce guidelines for incorporating loss and damage in official climate plans, and then also for the creation of a regular loss and damage gap report, which should also include cost estimates similar to UNEP's adaptation gap report. But on neither of those issues could countries reach an agreement, which is why matters were deferred. And again, for social protection here, I think it would be good to have a bit of a reflection in terms of the progress in positioning social protection systems as a loss and damage solution, especially now that the fund is probably going to start paying out money next year. So I know some of us we've been getting together on some of these issues regularly, but I think it would be really good now to touch base on that again. And then finally, just to say that there were two events. Well, there were more events, but two specifically on social protection. One at the World Bank Pavilion, which was co-hosted by UNICEF, and which was around mobilizing climate finance for social protection. That also had speakers from the GCF and the JEF, and which was really, really interesting. So I put the recording here. And then also at the ILO Pavilion, we had an event on the role of social protection for the global goal on adaptation, also discussing a little bit about potential indicators together with some of the experts working that were selected for the work program on indicators and representatives from social protection agencies as well as representatives from workers. So again, the link is there in case you would like to watch and catch up on it. So that's it in terms of an introduction. Would be really great now to hear from everyone what your thoughts are given given all these developments at COP. I'm sure many of you have been following it, especially on the financing. So yeah, it would be great to hear any reflections from people and also, just for us to keep discussing what all of this might mean for our work.
Yeah, just to allow everybody a moment to digest, because that was a lot and that was great. Jana, thanks for bringing us all these nice information on what happened and what did not happen and what we should be looking forward to. So thanks for that. I I personally had a question for you. Like, we are all thinking about COP30 already in many ways, and it's supposed to be one of these big COPs, a lot of momentum already picking up. So, I mean, we know that SBs in Bonn in June would be one of the first places where we get to influence that. But concretely speaking, for many of us practitioners, where do you see we should be focusing our energy, or anybody else can also pitch in, but generally, how do we engage with the process if we, if we want to start early? And I think we'll discuss much more in the working group, but just your thoughts, maybe.
Yeah, thanks, Sayanti. I mean, I think for me, also going to COP, having gone to COP last year, one of the big lessons is that you have to engage with the process throughout the year. So, usually at COP, they will be making decisions based on things that have happened throughout the year, right? So all of these different negotiation streams, they usually have, at least 3, 4 workshops throughout the year that different parties and observers go to. Then the SBs are an important touch point. And then once it gets to COP, actually, the sort of, it's not that the decisions are made, but the sort of the whole basis and the whole content has been shaped throughout the year. So usually at COP, there is not that much space to influence things anymore, right? Of course, you can go, you can try and speak to some of the negotiators and so on, and like change some words here and there. But really, sort of like the content and the big chunk, I think you have to engage throughout the year, through these different bodies, by maybe even writing blogs, by contributing to some of the publications, the dialogues, the workshops. Because I think that's really where you can start changing the thinking. And then at COP, especially through these kinds of events, they are interesting and they are good, but you will have a bit of a harder time to then actually influence anything in the negotiations through that, because the two things are usually quite separate, right? So, there's the whole space with the pavilions, and then there's the space with the negotiations, and there's usually very little sort of cross-fertilization between those.
Thanks, Jana. Very clear. Alex, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Jana, for the summary. I think what you didn't highlight sufficiently is the great work of ILO at the COP. So thanks for all the framework, but I think you had really good workshops on the GGA and the NDCs. And I think those were really important contributions if you look at the broader picture as of how SP was reflected at the COP. So we all know we saw less than the year before, but for this COP it's fine. But I think the ILO contributions were really, really important. We at the World Bank also had 2 events and focused a little bit on somewhere else. And we had a little bit of similar learnings again, Jana, to what you mentioned in the end. So I posted the 2 links to the events as well here in the chat. One was more on just transition in labor forces, and the second one was more on climate finance, and that the later one was done in collaboration together with Youth UNICEF, who came to our pavilion. What was interesting, you also reflected yesterday about the 2 events, and it became quite clear. So while we were kind of happy with attendance for both events, it was clearly visible that the first event on labor force and green transition, that wasn't visited as well, and was just very much focusing on, I would say, almost insular technical discussions, which is what our World Bank teams are used to do. And but you can have those discussions anywhere. So the question afterwards was, of course, why do we do all this effort if we have this kind of okay technical discussions? But then it became clear that for the second event, it was a completely different setting, because here it was about climate finance and a wider process of how social protection can play a bigger role for climate finance. And that was actually much more useful. It was not only much more well visited with attention from high level people from Germany, but also Azerbaijan. So that really came together nicely. And to us, this event was one milestone in a wider process. And that's how it makes sense for us. So the things that we will achieve, hopefully, on the climate finance side, and we already had follow-up discussions with Sif and the Jeff this week. That's a wider process. This will happen throughout the year. And the success that you have throughout the year determines how well things go at the COP. What we were really happy about, especially for the climate finance discussion, was that we didn't only talk to ourselves. Sometimes we have those events and we don't manage to get the climate core audience to our venues. But in this case, we had all the climate funds there, sitting, two on the podium and two in the audience. And we were also invited by the SIF to join one of their podiums. So that was really nice. So we saw that kind of this discussion starts happening, what we didn't see so much in our events in the past. So just to emphasize that point, the better is the work that we do throughout the year, the better, more successful these events will be, and the more we can leverage them for a wider outcome. That's it.
Thanks, Alex. Maybe just to add something to that, I think it also depends a little bit what it is that you're wanting to influence, right? Because there's obviously, I think in your case, it was really good in getting this conversation moving with the climate funds, right? And there you're really taking advantage of the fact that everyone is at COP, right? And that you're just, you're sort of like bringing people together, which you might have a difficulty getting together, at least in this kind of format in other instances. So I think that's, but then there's the other part of sort of really influencing very specific aspects of the negotiations, right? Which they are, of course, related, but they're also a little bit separate, because at the end of the day, the negotiations are extremely political processes that you sort of really, where you can achieve a lot, though, by really making connections and building the networks with the different negotiators throughout the year, and basically sort of like slowly socializing certain ideas, right? Because they cannot be experts in everything. So in these kinds of dialogues and workshops, that's really when you have the opportunity to sort of like bring certain issues onto the agenda. And my feeling is that as a working group, the thing is, these things are a lot of work, right? And you can't do it everywhere. But my feeling is that as a working group, we could see a little bit more how we could actually join efforts to do that, right? So just as an example, I know that there would be a lot of opportunity to get involved with some of the knowledge products that the WIM is producing on loss and damage, right? We're now more actively engaged on the global goal on adaptation and on the indicators, but it's a lot of work. On the just transition, there's opportunities to feed into these sort of dialogues, but all of this is quite a lot of work. So I think we can also at some point maybe discuss how we as a working group could also sort of put more our sort of efforts together to see if we can sort of influence some of those bits a bit more.
Completely agree to that. But I also see our kind of separation of labor already going to some extent. No, as the World Bank, we are focused. It was got more attention than I thought. No, the MDB. The MDBs got more of attention at this COP than at other COPs, and the climate funds. Why? Because the political landscape is as it is these days, and the money that is there lies with the funds and the MDBs very often. No, so I guess we kind of naturally focus on the funds also because they're 4 out of 5 are sitting with the World Bank. So again, I see this kind of separation of labor, which is perfect if we kind of are still aligned, no? As long as keeping connected and on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I ask what is your all sort of interpretations, or sort of what do you take away from this this quite low number on the NCQG, and what that means for our efforts in linking climate finance with social protection?
I mean, as I said, it kind of automatically guides the attention away from new money
Mm-hmm.
to existing money.
Mm-hmm.
So money that exists in the MDBs and in the funds.
Mm-hmm.
There is still a lot of money sitting there. Also, given that most of the international climate finance money is loans, no, whether you like it or not. But so that will the money will keep being there for those kind of purposes. So in terms of, because that's new money, no, the 300 billion or the 1 point whatever trillion, it looks not so well. No, even the 300 are super watered down. I mean,
Well,
that
especially if
numbers
you
are
take in,
massive.
I mean, there were some analyses, if you take inflation into account, they're barely a step up from the 100 billion.
Yeah, and then you bring in more of the private sector, and you bring in other numbers from China and other donors that are not yet in the Annex 1 countries. So it's hardly an increase. It's hardly an increase. It is a super disappointment. I go along with India there, no, who was afterwards really like not very pleased about this outcome.
Yeah.
The only good thing that yeah.
It's impressive that they still got managed to muster up so much energy.
They seem to have, yeah. Well, the only good thing, of course, some comments there is that at least we have any number. No, if I don't know how you felt, for me a bit more from a distance, I felt like, oh my God, hopefully this COP isn't like breaking down, with all the political questions that came up.
Yes.
So at least we continue talking. At least there is this idea of a roadmap towards BLM that is clearly in the trillion level, though. Let's see how the world looks next year.
Yeah.
At least Germany has a new government, and we know what we can expect from Trump and those things. No, those were real influences, no?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're right in the sense that everything was left very late. And I mean, I don't know, for those of you who managed to follow a little bit, we didn't even have a number until like the Thursday, and it was supposed to end on Friday, right? And I mean, I think that's also, for example, with the NAPs, I think they could have eventually got to an agreement, but they essentially ran out of time, which does relate a little bit also to the way in which it was managed, though, because it should be possible to get to an agreement, especially when there actually isn't too much, too huge pieces of divergence. But on quite a few of these things, they just sort of like ran out of time then. And then also, because the finance was such a big piece on some of the other negotiation streams, they were basically waiting until that piece was solved, right? Because it's always about the means of implementation in every work stream. So I think on a lot of the work streams, they wanted to see what happens in the finance, but then on the finance, nothing happened until really late, which then also made it too late really to get back to the other negotiation streams to sort out and iron out some of the issues that they still had in those. But yeah, I think I share your opinion. At least we reached something. I think it would have been worse for the process to not reach anything at all. Any more comments or questions?
I just wonder if Stefan is still here and wanted to elaborate on his comment in the chat for those who are not super familiar with this.
Is he still here? He is.
But we cannot hear you, Stefan. No, still not. All right. Maybe try in a minute or so. But thanks for that. Thanks for that, Alex and Jana. And what I'm hearing is there's much to do still. But definitely 2 COPs before I remember we were like, okay, we need to get climate people in our pavilions, and we need to make them come and introduce social protection to them. So I feel like there's been some movement from where we were and where we are now. So that's positive for me, definitely. So thanks for sharing that insight. And yeah, my connection seems unstable again. So I'll just let you guys say any last words you have or any other comments that are there in the room. And we can end 10 minutes early so that people can take a walk before the next meeting.
Thank you, Sayanti. And we'll let you finish your day because Sayanti's in India and it's already, what is it now, 8 or 9?
It's 9, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for excellent discussions, and Jana, thanks for that presentation. I found that super useful, as well as the chat afterwards. So much appreciated. And we'll be sharing. I could see some questions in the chat about presentations and recordings and stuff, and we'll share this shortly. Yeah.
Yep. Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Jana. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. We'll be in touch.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers all.
Much. Have a
Hey,
great
everyone.
Bye.